This will be a video about combat, and hopefully it won't wind up being combative. I do have my opinions on how I like systems to work and how I like to engage with the group when a combat arises, to make it fun and engaging for everybody, and to let us stretch and to make combat, just as much as the dramatic scenes, a way to explore who these characters are, what they care about, what they think is important, and so on. What this video does is lay out a bunch of different options and I guess hint at what their effects might be if you were to apply them. As you might expect, among the literal thousands of role-playing games which are out there, and among the ones that deal with combat in any significant way, there are different ways to handle the processing of all the information that goes into an interesting and engaging combat. Some games very strictly regiment things like the sequence of action, or they very clearly define units of time so that we can zoom in on that combat action. Some games even go so far as to focus on every single strike of the sword or attack and defense action, so that every single thrust or cut is backed up by a roll of the dice and an opportunity for the opponent to in some way defend. We can zoom in to that level. If that is possible, then therefore the opposite is possible, where we zoom out, and to greater and greater degrees it's possible to resolve an entire combat in one roll of the dice. This could even become so zoomed out, let's say, that one roll of the dice simply determines who narrates how the combat flows, rather than determining a victor. So we can zoom out and away from mechanical processing of the action to a point where the two are not involved at all. Now, in a game like Fantasy Flight Games Star Wars, or in any of the Ubiquity games, we have kind of a mid-level of zoom, and it's possible to push these games in either direction, but as described, we have a loose amount of time for one turn, and we have opposed rolls. Right? Now in Star Wars, that's one roll built from opposing forces, and in Ubiquity it's actual opposed rolls, or a roll against a difficulty. But what we end up with is, in this turn, this is the outcome. And this could be described as being, I thrust my lightsaber, I thrust my rapier, I thrust my Bowie knife, into his abdomen. Ugh. Or, without any unfaithfulness to the mechanic as presented, you might narrate an exchange between the combatants, which ends up with damage being done. Doesn't have to be one roll of the dice equals one blow of the sword. It could be one roll of the dice determines the outcome of that period of time. Now, none of this for long-term players should be anything new. Every time you pick up a new game and get into the combat section, if you're paying attention to that game as that game, you start to notice the differences. Right? How many actions does the game talk about taking? In what way does it organize and sequence these actions? Do you have things like a number of free actions, a number of significant actions or combat actions, a number of maneuvers, which are less? Looking at it from the Star Wars perspective, for example, or looking at it from Ubiquity, where you have one move, one attack, and basically a decreasing resource of defense. Games handle combat differently, and they have leeway, say left or right, determining how granular that one combat roll or one sequence of combat rolls can be. Another factor which can be adjusted is the perspective from which description of combat comes. So beyond how we process the number of discrete attack and defense actions which might occur within a defined, loosely defined, or not at all defined amount of time, there's also this point of view or voice in which description comes from the player. Now this could be seated deeply in the character, meaning that the player will be saying I. They'll be narrating all action from the point of view of I. This could be slightly outside the seat of character and more rooted in the experience of fiction told from the first person, where we get a mix of description of action and thought. So not just I cut at him, but as I cut at him, I am thinking, I'm worried or sweating or whatever. We get into more description than might be noted by someone actually there. Deeper insights. We can go still further outside of character and step more deeply into the scene. Again, we can imagine this as from a fictional point of view, where we get a perspective outside that of our protagonist, and we're no longer thinking about I, we're thinking about he or she or they or whatever. We are looking at the action, not experiencing the action in terms of what the vehicle of our narration is allowing us to process or guiding us toward experiencing. Once we are outside of the character and immersing ourselves in the scene, then we have still more choices. We can simply leave it from the point of view of literature with what is thought or experienced, and description comes from kind of this omnipresent narrator, or we can refine it down and give what's often called a cinematic experience, wherein on top of our imagination of the scene, we are now imagining how that would be portrayed on screen, so that we imagine the presence of a camera or camera operators who are there zooming in, panning across, playing over, and we add this on top of the description. So now we've moved from the first person to the third person, and we've moved from, let's say, an in-character perspective to a narrator's perspective to a film or a director of cinematography perspective. And there are other perspectives. All of this for the description of combat. There are a lot of different adjustments that we can make to process a scene. Some of them will be slower than others, some of them will be faster than others. A lot of them allow you to express the same amount of information and so wind up somewhere in the middle in terms of speed. But each one has, of course, their strengths and weaknesses, and identifying what those are can assist in the choice if you plan on making this choice at all. Because as always, it's always possible to run a combat just as the players, right? Roll to hit. Okay. I get 4 successes. Great. They defend with 3. You do 1 lethal damage. That could be a fun combat. Or it could be body language. Player rolls, gets 4 successes. Everybody sees the 4 successes on the table. The game master indicates that there have been 3 defensive successes, so 1 lethal wound has passed through. None of this has been described in terms of system. And then the player, because they have the upper hand in this sequence, begins to narrate either as I or as she what happens. Right? I direct the blow to the side and step inside the length of their blade and direct a cut across their torso, but I'm not really sure if it gets through the heavy cloth of their doublet. So I slam my elbow into their chest and cut again, driving them backwards so that I can launch a thrust and it goes through the upper shoulder. There's blood, but I'm not sure how injured they are. Now all of this is that one roll, that same thing. I got 4 successes. There are 3 defensive successes. You do 1 lethal wound. The player has narrated a sequence where they wind up on top and an amount of damage is done. Same thing can be done in Fantasy Flight Game Star Wars, and there's lots of games out there where you can do that. Where you can't do this is in Mythras, per se, because what we're doing there is simulating each discrete moment in time. Combats are short and brutal. Combat, for all of this seeming extra detail, doesn't get any slower, doesn't take more time than what I'm describing for Ubiquity, really. But it does involve a different point of view. Right? Each motion of the sword rather than a sequence. Which way gives your group the most enjoyment? There we have our choice. Do I couch this in I? Do I couch this in pronouns, he, she, they? Or do I focus more on things like camera moves or an attempt to make it feel or sound like your favorite author or literature? We have these choices, but there are more choices even yet. For example, who does the describing? Who is the narrator for the combat, or this part of the combat, or this turn, or whatever? In Fantasy Flight Game Star Wars, we get the option to have the person who rolls. If that roll comes up as a successful action for them, then they are the ones who describes what happens, as modified by the Game Master for information or processing of other information outside their control. So there's a kind of encoded collaboration there. If the roll comes up as a failure for their intended action, then it's the Game Master who describes the whole thing. Again, possibly getting input from the player on how it might look. There's no reason why this can't happen in other games. Sometimes it happens unconsciously. You've been doing it all along and not realized it. This goes along with, where do you place that roll? Before, in the middle of, or after the description? And you'll have your own reasons for why you might do that, but let's take a look at some. Let's say we're going to talk about collaborative description, meaning the Game Master is going to supply some of the information about the outcome of a roll, and the person who's successful will supply the rest. So that might be entirely the Game Master in the case of a failure, or it might be the Game Master and the player, or mostly the player. So that's what we're taking as the basis for our example. And now, where do we roll? We can come up and realize that an encounter is going to happen. Weapons are drawn, and we're going to now roll for the outcome of an attack action from the player. If they're successful, they're going to describe it. If they're not successful, the Game Master is going to describe it. Where do you put the roll? Does the roll come first? You see what the results are. Then have the victor narrate. Do you have the player start the description so we get a visual sense of what it is they're attempting? And then at that telling moment, stop them, have them roll, and then continue with the outcome based on success or failure? Or do we have them narrate the whole thing, roll at the end, and find out if that intention happens or not, and then narrate any failures as needed? So let's go through that again. Combat is enjoined. The player has stated that their character is going to attack, so the dice are invoked. Player rolls. We see success, and they continue on expanding on their intention to attack. They describe exactly how that sequence of time, in the way that you've already decided you're going to handle it, plays out. Or they begin a description, stop, roll, and find out how that beginning will end. Or they narrate their pure intention. If they could have a wish, what would happen? They narrate that. Then roll the dice and determine if they get their wish. If they do, they move on to the next person. If they don't, the Game Master narrates what really happens. It is, I think, easy to get a sense for how that decision will influence the tone of a combat. We tend to get myopic in combat, and our view zeroes in on the active participants. The rest of the scene tends to fade in the background, which is why there's so much advice about using the environment to spice up your combats, right? And why swashbuckling as a genre is by some considered to be very challenging, because again, you need to remember that those really fun scenes in swashbuckling adventures involves the use of more than just the character's fighting ability. It's really not about killing the opponent. It's about defeating the opponent or escaping from the dangerous situation. It's not a bloodbath. It's a triumph of virtue and skill and this sort of thing. So how do we get there most easily, most satisfyingly for our group? Do we put that roll first? What does that allow? How does that affect the narration? If we put the roll first, then when you think about it, the player is exposed to fewer opportunities for the reason their attempt wasn't successful being a mistake that they made. You tried, but you failed. Happens more often in the other two rolls. The rolls themselves are identical. Right? The statistics don't change. The probabilities don't change, but the location of where the roll comes has an effect on what we end up saying, and what we end up saying is the entirety of the experience of the game. So, if we're rolling in the middle, you try this and fail, inertia being what it is, improvisation being what it is, the onus for that failure tends to fall on the active person. It's much easier, it's much more likely to turn that attempt into a mistake, an error. They did something that led to them not being successful with their attack. Likewise, at the end, this is the cool thing I want my character to do. Pretty easy to imagine that being met by some sort of punitive description. Aha, you tried this amazing thing, but no, slap, you didn't do it. I'm not saying this is all groups. I'm talking about habits or high probabilities of interaction at the table between people who are having a good time together. People want to laugh, and often making someone the butt of a joke, making someone responsible for a failure, can lead to laughter. Putting the roll first, when there's success, gives the character a chance, or gives the player a chance to handle how their character appears with that success. But it doesn't expose them to as much punishment. We roll, we don't have a description of any kind of action at all yet. We see that the roll has failed. How does that happen? The Game Master is equally likely to describe the villain in the scene as doing something cool which prevents character success, which is not the same thing as failing at all. That's being stopped, balked, and it can lead to greater tension, that desire to overcome the opponent, which leads to better and better description, I feel. You can hear my bias. I like rolling first, but each one has their distinct effect. What game are you playing? How are you playing it? What do you want from it? You might even find that you'll want to shift the location of the role depending on the scene. I talked about swashbuckling earlier. When we get into space opera, fantasy like Star Wars is, where do we want the role to happen? What kind of mood do we have? Is this Luke freeing his friends on Jabba's barge kind of mood? Or is this Luke and Vader in Cloud City? That kind of mood. Definitely not the same thing. To draw from Three Musketeers literature, is this D'Artagnan on the way to Paris, right, meeting ruffians in the roadhouse, or is this Athos commanding D'Artagnan to ride while he sacrifices himself? Which scene is it? Obviously, mixing and matching and adjusting, applying all of these different options and others will have a significant effect on how your game feels, will have a significant effect on how quickly your game plays, making it faster or longer. None of these so far will have a strong effect on player engagement. You may still find that players drift away during sequences which aren't directly about them. Right? They're tuning out, waiting for their turn. If this is a problem that you face, nothing here is really going to address that. And in fact, if you have that kind of player and you're trying to share narration and you're trying to involve them in using the scene and to view the world in a certain way, then when they check out and check back in, you may have to spend even more time catching them up than you would just by doing I got 4 successes. I defended with 3. Take 1 lethal. Right? How can we increase engagement in combat? For me, making them faster works. For me, having high stakes works. For me, forgetting the idea of any kind of encounter balance works. And what I realize is that what I'm talking about is including ambiguity in the game. To always be 100% clear about things like distance between you and the opponent, numbers of visible opponents, opportunities for cover which might hide more things, implying danger which may or may not be there but logically could be, hinting at motivations which might or might not be true, putting in hooks for people to think about when it's not their turn can be a way to heighten interest and tension. It can be a way for this combat to lead into more things than just combat, leading into discussions of the situation or scenario afterward, either in character or by the players after the session. What is really going on? Why did that happen? What was all of that about? What were these clues for? What do you think this person really meant? This sort of thing. Why did this encounter happen at all is one of my favorites. Is this just luck? Is this genre representation? Well, every few minutes the Cardinals Guard or the Stormtroopers or whatever stumble across our heroes from a Chandlerian sense. If you're not really sure what should happen next, introduce somebody with a gun. Could just be that. Or there could be something happening in the background. Instead of doing a cutscene where we see the villain doing something and being very explicit about something the characters don't know, we can have an unusual occurrence which might have a reason rather than random chance and get people thinking about it. There are lots of ways to adjust the basic moving parts that make a combat. These are just some of them. What do you do with combat? Let's talk about it.